My name is Sue Miller, and I work for SRF Consulting, helping the Office of State Aid out with delivering this series of webinars, sharing some of the work that has been done by the Local Road Research Board over the last 10 plus years in the system preservation world. Today, we're sharing module number 2. Module number 2 talks about determining the gap and how do you want to, one of the strategies of all the multitude of strategies that are out there of how you can go about trying to address a shortfall on delivering your transportation system. So just a quick reminder, all of these webinars are being recorded and will be shared on the Minnesota Department of Transportation State Aid, the SALT website under the training tab. So you'll be able to access all of the recordings of the webinars. After this webinar is over, we will send out a copy, a PDF copy of all the slides that were shared today. Today is an added bonus or an added gift. You'll get an Excel spreadsheet or a gap analysis tool that we'll share out with you. And we'll also share a PDH certificate out for all those attending the webinar today. And then as we go through the module, just keep in mind that one of the ways we set this webinar series up is for this to be interactive and to learn from each other and to continue to learn from each other, because that's what this whole initiative kind of bloomed out of city and county engineers sharing with each other what they were doing and what was working. So we will be hosting office hours after every webinar for people to get together, discuss, ask questions, share some best practices and things that are working well on their system. So with that, I don't see that Scott has joined. So we'll just go ahead and get started, but Scott would like to say welcome if he was here today, so. So today is module number 2. Last month, we did the overall introduction to system preservation. What does that mean? How is system preservation different than, say, pavement preservation? We're looking at your whole network, your whole system of your transportation network. And what does it take to, construct, operate, maintain that network? And in doing that, module number 2 today talks about understanding, are you funded to where you need to be? And what is the gap? And if you have a gap, what are some strategies you can use to start to close that gap? And as an underlying theory throughout all of the modules is that communication strategy that is really key to working with your elected officials and working with the public to understand what it is that you can or cannot do in your role as a city or a county engineer or working in those systems. So just a quick recap. This started long ago with that understanding that there just isn't enough funding. And what we learned at the last webinar, the opening webinar number 1, is funding is definitely a constraint, but you all are very, very challenged in this world now of trying to hire enough staff to be able to adequately own, operate, and maintain your systems. So when you don't have enough funding and you don't have enough staff, what are the ways that you can help yourself be able to deliver your system more efficiently, more effectively? It's not a one-size-fits-all solution of what was developed here, because every city and every county is different, and what works in one place might not work in another place, but it might. So we're sharing out some of those strategies. So first and foremost, when you're looking at your system, you want to identify the needs. What do you feel are your most critical needs in your system? And then based on those needs, what are the strategies that would best help you solve that? And how would you like to go about implementing? And as I mentioned, all the way through is engagement and education. If you're not working with your elected officials and the public and keeping people informed and doing this in an open, transparent process, then you might make it a little bit harder on yourself. So today really gets into defining that gap and looking at what is it that you're doing today with the money that you have, whether it's using your state aid allotment or your levy dollars or the combination thereof, and how are you using that money? Where are you investing it on your system versus what resources could you use? How much more money would you need if you wanted to maintain your system at a little bit higher standard? And what was developed is a gap tool to be able to look at your system and calculate that out and see in year one, what's my shortfall? It was designed to be an easy, simple to use spreadsheet that you can all see the formulas. We know as engineers, we don't like tools where it's data in, data out, and we can't see the formulas and the data in the background. So it's all open where you can see everything. And if you have skilled staff, or I mean, clearly I wasn't the skilled staff that could do this, but several counties have taken this tool and modified it and made it into exactly what represents what they need based on the formulas that are there. You can tweak this tool as to what you want it to be. So some of the needs that you'll need to know, though, to use this tool is you really need to know your system characteristics. You need to know how many centerline miles or lane miles are in your system. You're going to need to know what is your current level of investment. What practices are you using? Do you do full-blown reconstruction every year? Are you doing that every 5 years? Are you doing more full depth reclamation, or are you strictly in preservation mode on pavements? And then we'll look at that of what your current activity is compared to what the industry typical is, say for optimal maintenance practices. And by doing that, that'll define what your gap would be. So some of the things when we talk about system characteristics, we're talking about the size of your network, like I mentioned, the number of miles. But the other things to think about as you're thinking about strategies is you need to know the volume and the type of traffic. If your system is very high traffic, high ADT, or very heavy commercial traffic, then that's going to require different strategies for you to apply when you look at your gap. The available budget that you have, what's your staff availability and ability. Certain strategies in your construction world might not be available if you don't have enough staff to do 5 miles of rural grading, and you don't have enough staff available to cover all of that. Certainly the climatic conditions that we're in after you all have been experiencing one of our wettest springs in the last few years after some drought condition, and understanding the impacts of some of those things. If you have an asset management system and you're looking at things from that life cycle costing perspective, this can help you do that too. And what are your resources, your materials that are available? Are you in a county that you have access and good opportunity to bid projects as both asphalt or concrete, or is it limited in one area or another? Or your contractors sometimes can be a limiting factor on what kinds of strategies you can use. And finally, sometimes the political sentiment or the public appetite for certain types of strategies might limit what you do out there in the field. Maybe the public doesn't really want you to seal coat because they don't like to get tack on their cars or whatever it might be. You've all seen this, the typical, pavement life cycle of how to maintain and invest into your pavement, doing the right thing to the right road at the right time. And, we're not going to get into this because you all have seen many pavement preservation presentations. But if you invest those dollars at the optimal time, rather than waiting till your pavement gets into a deteriorated condition, you're actually saving money on the system and investing in a very economical and efficient way. Some of the resources that are available to help you manage your system. As I mentioned, the state aid website has a training module, and they've got a number of resources on the state aid website on pavement preservation and MnDOT's pavement preservation. Federal Highway's got pavement preservation. So there's a lot of pavement resources out there. And we talk about pavements a lot because for many of you, pavements are your biggest asset out there in your network. And then followed by your bridge system typically. And now I know there's a lot of cities that are on this call, and we're not getting into your underground infrastructure, which certainly plays into what you're doing on the surface. If your water main and your sanitary sewer is 80, 90 years old, that's going to dictate different strategies that you look at for what you're going to do with that surface, because you're more than likely going to be doing some full depth or some deeper excavations that might require full regrading or full depth reclamation. So all these links and resources will be available to you after this meeting if you don't already have them bookmarked and linked in your browsers at home. So to take a look at what the GAP tool will do, this is a screenshot of taking a look at a system that's out there in Minnesota and looking at, this is representative of Otter Tail County at a point in time in the past, and looking at their strategies and the way that they would do things and what their average cost per mile was a few years ago. So what it does is it looks at that industry standard that I mentioned, and how many miles per year should you be doing things versus how many miles per year are you doing things. And you can calculate based on what your cost is in your county or your city, what your annual gap is. It also has the ability to add in variable inflation rates. So you can use that. So when you project out in year 1, year 2, year 3, or year 1, year 5, year 10, what kind of gap you're looking at. And I think this was one of the biggest things that came out of doing this analysis for all of the people that have used this tool. It's that snowball effect. And you all know what I'm talking about, is when you don't have enough money in year 1 and you don't have enough money in year 2, it just builds and builds and builds. And by using a tool like this to be able to show that gap, you can show that an $11 million gap in year 1 snowballs to a $65 million gap in year 5. So it's not $11 million a year, it's a snowball effect where it's increasing at an exponential rate. So your preservation practice and what you're doing to your pavements is what's going to get measured against what is known to be and documented by research as the industry typical. So in the industry, they would say you should seal coat your pavement surfaces every 10 years. And if your agency has 300 miles, then that tells you should be seal coating 30 miles a year. But sometimes we don't have enough money to seal coat 30 miles a year. So we've been seal coating 20 miles a year. So you have a 10-mile gap. If your average cost for a seal coat was $25,000, well, then you get $250,000 for that year. So that is the methodology or the process, if you will, behind creating the tool. Very simple, very high level. We wanted to keep it so you could at least tell the story in a way that people can understand, and it could be repeatable. So the other thing you need to keep in mind when we talk about inflation factors is looking at other research. The buying power of your dollars from 2011 through 2030 is reduced by 37%. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say this is a little bit of a dated slide, and I would venture a guess that by 2030, we're probably looking at a 50% reduction in what our buying power is, just because of the inflationary costs that you all have been experiencing on your systems. So you want to keep in mind that that buying power needs to be taken into consideration when you're looking out into how are you going to fund your system and what are your needs in your system in the future. So looking at a typical county system, Otter Tail County was our demo county for this one. Miles of asphalt roads, a little over 1,000 miles. Most of them are county state aid highways. Otter Tail County is unique because every one of their miles is paved as an asphalt road. They have no gravel on their system anyway, or anywhere. And then looking at the number of bridges on the system as well. And you can do a similar type analysis with your cost of your bridges and what you should be building. So by looking at the pavement condition data, Olmsted or Otter Tail County was able to establish that almost 60% of their roads are already over 20 years old. And if 60% of their roads are over 20 years old, then in the next 20 years, they're gonna have to spend a lot more money. And you can't manage what you don't measure. So you have to measure and see what that pavement condition data is telling you as far as what are you doing today and what can you forecast is your need into the future. So looking at that gap analysis, we came up with that $11.8 million a year funding gap. And again, you add in what that current expenditure is, you should be spending $15 million a year in Otter Tail County. Using a simple tool like this to educate and work with your elected officials can really help you make the case at this time of the year when you're starting to do those budget talks and you're working with your city councils, your county boards, your administration staff. So you can tell that story of where your shortfall exists and what the system is going to look like with an investment or without an investment. And so it helps you with the levy, it helps you in pursuing grant funding, it helps you in looking at other opportunities if you want to adopt, say, a local option sales tax. So I'm going to take a minute here and just swap screens and walk you through what that gap tool looks like. So hopefully now you can all see the Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, but it's got an automated kind of walkthrough tab here. So you see where this click here to start the gap analysis is. We can click on that and it'll say you can start a new gap analysis or we can edit a previous gap analysis. And to save time, I started one that we're going to go in and edit. But if we were going to start a new one, we would put the agency data in whatever your county's name is, and then go into your next steps. And then you can put your number of miles in. How many of your miles are urban? How many of your miles are rural? How many are concrete? How many are gravel? So this is where you need to know what your system is. And then you need to look at how many miles a year are we reconstructing? Now I know this is completely a fictional example because I don't know very many counties out there that can reconstruct 30 miles a year. But just to look at how the tool works, I just threw some numbers in here for how many miles. Now, the thing you have to do is you have to choose whether or not you're using centerline miles or lane miles. So if you're an urban county and you have a lot more lane miles than centerline miles, you can take that into account and use the tool accordingly. The tool is also built that there's a couple of vacant fields. So if you have a specific strategy in your network that you're using for maintaining your system, or if you want to forecast your bridges through these elements, these blank boxes, you can also check to use the custom entries. Check this box right here, and you can do customized fields for that. And again, we're on a centerline system, not a lane miles on this example. You also have to make a choice on average dollars per mile. What's your cost per mile that you're spending? Or if you calculate things out using maybe an industry data set using average dollars per square yard, you can do it either way. Either way you want to do it for these fields, you can add that in. And then as you go in, you can pick an inflation factor. I have no idea what the current inflation factor is in the industry right now. It's probably higher than 5%. You can customize that to be what you want it to be. And then you'll have your analysis that will generate, for this example, we are looking at about a $10 million, well, between the county state aid and the county road system, a $33 million annual gap. And after 5 years, you're looking at a $52 million gap. So actually 52 billion based on these numbers. So I picked a big county and a big set of numbers. So you can use this tool and modify it the way you want. You can also, if you don't want to go through those fields of clicking the box, you can go right into these fields here, and you can modify in the actual tables that feed into this. The typical 50-year life cycle is here based on industry practice and what our local road research board research shows on, what's a typical 50-year life cycle for your road system. So that's a quick, fast overview of what that gap tool looks like, and I will share that out after the meeting today with the attendees for today, and we'll get it uploaded back onto, it's on the LRB website, but we'll get it uploaded onto MnDOT's website as well, on the SALT website, so you all will have access to it a couple different ways. So the GAP tool is there, that was developed with several counties involved, but certainly it's not the only way you can go about calculating your gap. If you have a methodology that works for your county, as long as it can be easily, you can tell the story around it, you can replicate the data, and understand what you have for the data, you can use a variety of other methods to be able to annually tell that story with your elected officials and your public. So this is another example from Freeborn County, where simply by importing your county state aid needs data and then populating for your county road system similar data sets off of using some of your pavement condition data or other records in your offices, you can calculate this out. So under the road number, it's, CASA 1 there's those segments of CASA 1 are the first 5 entries, and planning out when those roads would tentatively fall into each year. And you can set what your max age of grading would be and which segments you'd want to be able to see that. Since the last date of grading in your needs database, you can say, I want to see all those segments that are older than 50 years old since we last graded them based on our needs data. Or you can look at your needs data and say, I want to see everything that is more than 20 years since our last surfacing, or 40 years. And then you can throw in whatever grading cost per mile that you're spending. What does it cost you in your particular organization to know how much that's going to cost you? So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. The key point there is when you start sharing this information with your elected officials and the public, you want to make sure you're consistent with what you're sharing and how you're sharing. And if somebody wants to question you on the data, then you can easily and in a transparent way be able to share that with them. So, quick recap of the gap analysis outcomes. It really does give you an opportunity to set that baseline of, we can only do so much with the resources we have. And you can share that with your elected officials. You can do this at, if you're doing an open house with what your construction program is going to look like for the next 5 years, you can use these kinds of slides to help educate people and keep putting this in front of people a couple of times a year or every other year when you're doing setting your levies or whatever it might be. It also gives you the opportunity to look at some long-range planning and to say that, we know we have some gaps out there and we need to look at either, are there opportunities here for getting some new revenue into our system? And, in my experience as a county engineer, when I first got to the county, it had been 13 years since the levy had been increased for the road and bridge department. And it took about a year or two of education before we started seeing some really significant and serious infusions of cash, if you will, from that levy, and getting the county board to understand that level of investment and why that levy needs to increase to maintain a road and bridge system that they need and they wanted to deliver for their users. So Dan's going to help here with a quick poll on gap status. So the first question is has your agency ever defined a system gap? And that's just a quick yes or no. Whether or not you're already doing some form of a gap. And the second part of that question is who are you communicating it to? Have you been able to communicate it, or do you have a methodology for that? I'll give you all a few minutes for this one.
Yeah, we're seeing those results come in. We'll plan to keep it open for another minute and then close and share out results.
So I think we have most people responding so far. It looks like about a third of you, a little more than a third of you has calculated that funding gap for your system. So it's about 1/3, 2/3 on whether or not you're using that calculation of a system gap. And about half of you are communicating what you're doing with your elected officials. A little bit less with the public, and we are definitely in a time where it's difficult to share things with our public, and the public gets a little bit apathetic sometimes about hearing about government being broke. But when you start to be able to show them what you could do with more money, and we'll get into that when we get into some of the performance measures and the other opportunities in the future modules, we'll be able to share some of those things out on how you can tell that story and show people what that added investment will give them. So 41% of you are sharing information with your elected officials, 24% with the elected officials and the public, and 35% of you say they all know we're broke and not a huge need to communicate. And then the final split was about 40% of you are calculating that gap and defining what that is for a system gap, and 60% can use the new tool or use this tool. So thanks, Dan. So just a quick overview. Again, the transportation plan or a comprehensive plan is one of the strategies that we talked about in the overview session as being one of those ways that you can really lay out a game plan for what does your system look like, what goals and objectives, what performance measures is important to your community, and what is it going to take to get there. And several counties have done transportation plans, but Otter Tail County went through a very robust process of doing a transportation plan specifically targeting the gap and what were they going to try to do to go after that gap. So to do a transportation plan, you can do these in-house. If you have enough staff and enough time and enough skill set, you don't necessarily need to hire outside expertise. Many people do. And typically that cost is around $90,000, depending on what you want to do, how robust you want your plan to be. If you want it to be a very robust, comprehensive plan, it could be $150,000. And even if you use an outside entity to help you with this, there still has to be a high amount of staff involvement to do this. You're going to have to be able to share what it is that you are currently doing on your system, what's your strategies, what's your historical investment in your roadways, what is your goals or your targets of where you'd like to be investing or the level of service you'd like to deliver. So a couple things to think about when you're going through that process of deciding, do you want to go forward with a transportation plan, is, do you have enough staff time to be able to invest in this right now and to be able to share that kind of data back with whoever's helping you build the plan, or if you're building it yourself? And then that public engagement and that stakeholder engagement, not just with your elected officials, but with the public throughout the process. It does take a lot of time and effort, but the rewards are huge if you can develop a very educated community around what is going on with your transportation system. It's also good to have your public and your stakeholders involved in defining what those goals and objectives are. And we've seen some shifts in Minnesota over the last couple of years we want to see less reliance on one person in one car going down the highway. And maybe we would like to see people have opportunities for a multimodal choice and get out of the car, which might say now we have to develop or enhance our systems that we had in place for people who want to bike, walk, or roll. Having good traffic forecast data is an absolute must to be able to develop a good analysis of your system in a transportation plan. And sometimes that can take, if you're in a high growth area, that can take some additional study and forecasting to be able to look at what is your traffic needs, what do you see your traffic impacts, what parts of your network are going to be impacted the most by that growth. And that probably is going to take a little higher investment level than just being able to take, here's our traffic counts based on when we get our traffic counts and we're applying a growth factor to it. Again, every city, every county is going to be different on what your priorities are and what data you have and what data you want to use and how you go about implementing these plans. Some entities like to be really policy driven on what they do so that there's a solid policy behind what they do. Others will implement just with internal staff. What I like to say about transportation planning is these cannot be plans that live in a 3-ring binder and collect dust up in your bookshelf. They really have to be a living, breathing plan that you use over the next 10 years, if that's what your forecasted time frame is for your plan. So you are actually using this plan on a regular basis, month to month, year to year, and it's not just an exercise you go through. So some of the data sets that are out there that you're going to want to look at, or the general approach, is really understanding what's your social and economic trends that are going on in your county. Are you an aging county? Do you have a lot of influx of new people moving into your city? Are you high growth? Are you no growth or a declining county? Those all help understand what your opportunities here are and how your land is being used. If you're in a area that's got a lot of mining in it, for example, and you're got a lot of heavy commercial traffic because of the mining needs, you need to understand those land use impacts as well. You also need to understand what is the current condition of your infrastructure. Now, I've been in the industry for a long, long time, and the city I began in had a city engineer that the mandate was 2 inches of bituminous over the top of whatever was there for our city network. And over time, with heavier loads and heavier garbage trucks and heavier school buses, that 2 inches of bituminous paving was not enough to sustain a system, and the system had to change. So knowing what your system current condition is and what most of your system is built out to be, what your bridges are, what's the conditions, and what are the requirements of that system will help you decide what you need to do for future performance measures. Safety is number one for you all. I know that. There is absolutely no worse feeling for any city engineer, county engineer, than to have a fatal crash somewhere on your system. So making sure that that safety stays first and foremost in what your decision-making process is pretty key. And you all already are doing that. Minnesota's got such a great safety culture where we're very focused on making sure that our system is safeguarded in a safe system, anticipating that while most crashes are based on human error, we're going to make sure that our systems are built in a way to safeguard people from themselves to the greatest extent possible. We talked a little bit about pavement quality. Minnesota, again, is rich with data that we've got pavement condition data for most of the city and county systems. We also get that traffic volume from our partnership with the state aid system. And then to be able to look at, your whole system from the functional class and what your mobility is and what your goals and objectives might be and how does that drive your performance measures. And if you have all of that figured out, then you can start looking at things like, do we want to look at some jurisdictional transfers, or do we want to look at some designation changes and changing some functional classes around because it was built, the system was outlined saying that this should be an arterial and it no longer is going to function like that. Like I mentioned before, we're looking at a lot more choice in our transportation network. And so considering, do you have freight needs? Do you want transit to be included in your plan? Some people do their plans and they list out a project improvement list, almost like a 10-year capital improvement plan, if you will, or a high-level capital improvement plan. You don't necessarily have to do that, but some entities like to do that and like to know what kind of funding sources they have to be able to fund that list in a constrained environment. And then how do you want to implement? Do you want to create some policies around protecting key right-of-way areas for future access management, making sure you have enough room for the growth that you're predicting? looking at other corridor studies you might have done and making sure you're incorporating those goals and principles into this larger initiative is always a good investment as well. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of some of the other strategies we talked about in the introductory module, because when you do a transportation plan, you really are looking at several strategies as different elements or components of a transportation plan. So jurisdictional transfers, we talked about this back in June in the overview, is really looking at, is this road on the right system? Is the right travel modes being covered here? Or should it either turn up to a higher agency or turn down to a different agency that because it is more of a local access? So Anoka County did a case study, a couple of case studies about how to best go about doing jurisdictional transfers, how to communicate that. It's something to consider when you're doing a transportation plan, whether or not that is a strategy you want to include in your transportation plan. Some communities are very open to it. Other communities, this is a non-starter from the very beginning. So you also need to know what's the political climate in your city or county before you would undertake this one. A tiered system. Levels of service are going to change. Maintenance standards are going to change. And if you are constrained, you may want to change what you do on certain roads. Maybe there are certain strategies from a construction standpoint you only do on your higher class roads or your roads that are functionally classed as minor arterials and above. Maybe if it's classified as a local road, maybe you never program in a full-blown reconstruction on a local road. Maybe those roads are only ever going to see a level of service where you're doing more maintenance type activities. Those are the choices and decisions you can make once you understand what your system goals and objectives are. Reverting surfaces or unpaving, if you will. Again, when you look at that, maybe a tiered system approach, and you start to look at where your investment can get you and where it can't get you, might show you a couple of places in your network that you no longer have the financial fortitude to be able to maintain that in a safe way as a paved system, and it may be better to maintain it as an unpaved or a well-maintained gravel road system. One of my old mentors said that one of the biggest lessons he learned is that the public will tolerate a great, well-maintained gravel road over a really poorly maintained asphalt road. So it's just something that you have to think about and know and understand. Would your users tolerate that? Performance measures is a good one to talk about with your elected officials and with your public, to say, you know, what is the condition we want our network to be in, and educating your public on what that system will look like. If you say we're over investing here or under investing here, we want to put more money into our bridges, that means we're going to put a little less money in our pavements, and we're going to tolerate a lower pavement condition rating. Those are trade-offs of how you can move money around to what you define to be your performance measure that you really find to be the critical one you need to meet for your system. Project prioritization, again, this is a way to look at your system and make those investment decisions. When you're in a fiscally constrained environment, one of the things that all of you face at some point in time in your career is, why are you spending money and investing in this and not over here on that? And by having defined criteria and a methodology that guides that. Now, I will give you the caveat here. You always have engineering judgment. These are things that guide your decision-making, but in no way, shape, or form can it ever be your decision-making process. It can guide you, and then you still have to apply that engineering judgment to understand. Revenue resources. There's been a lot of opportunity in the last 10, 15 years to add a county wheelage tax, or if you have a county that has a high gravel tax or high gravel production, maybe gravel tax is important to you. The sales tax opportunities have been a huge opportunity for certain counties and some cities to make investments. There's certainly more conversation going on about, you know, a overall street tax for the municipalities, and some of these take a lot of legislative work before we have those as new revenue sources. But again, going through these processes where we're educating the public and we're educating elected officials, some of those elected officials eventually become your state senator, and they remember how tough it was to deliver a city network. And maybe that's when we finally get legislative authorization to do some of those things. So overall, all of these things come together to pull together that overall comprehensive transportation plan. And some of the questions you want to ask are, what are your needs in your specific system? How do you want to address them? What kind of implementation and action do you need to take? Why this road, not that road? What work needs to be invested in? Or is it investing more in safety strategies, or more in your bridge system, or more in multimodal and a trail or a transit system? When are the projects going to be needed? You can forecast out based on all segments of your transportation network on what you need and when those projects should be funded, and you can then show whether that funding will allow you to complete that or not. So Dan, we have one more quick poll here on transportation planning. So many people, if you're in the urban metropolitan area, are required to have transportation or comprehensive plans updated on a regular basis, but not all of Minnesota is that way. So just take a moment and share if in the last 5 years, have you had an updated transportation or comprehensive plan completed for your organization? And what are those limitations to implementing that plan? Once you get a plan, what is limiting you the most? Is it the time to commit to that, or the funding, or what is limiting you in being able to deliver that plan? We'll give you all a few minutes or a minute or so here. I think we have most of you chiming in here. So about 70% of you, which is much higher than I anticipated, have completed a transportation plan in the last 5 years, and 30% have not. And one of the biggest challenges to delivering those plans is, of course, that constrained funding piece. 86% of you say that that funding piece is one of the biggest challenges in being able to implement that plan. And certainly, as we talked about in module 1, those staffing limitations, the time commitment needed to do this, about 50% of you are saying that time is also one of those limiting factors to be able to implement your transportation plan. All right, thanks, Dan, for that. So just to wrap up and kind of summarize, when you're looking at a transportation comprehensive plan, you want to really look at what are the data needs that you have, or what are the data sets that you have. And you want to be able to capture so much of this data that we already have in Minnesota. And we are very fortunate to have the amount of data that we have. In other states and other cities and counties, they don't have a good partnership with their state aid office where they have good safety data, or they have good pavement data, or other traffic volume data. So we're pretty fortunate to have all these data sets at our fingertips here. It's just a matter of pulling it all together. Understanding how your city or your county is connected and what that mobility need is. And again, you know, looking at, are you looking at having to add lanes, or was your system built out to be 4 lanes and now you're looking at 4 to 3 lane conversions because you want to make room for multimodality? Those are some of the things you can look at doing those volume to capacity ratios. And creating those goals and objectives to say, we do want to be more multimodal, or we know we have a graying and older socioeconomic community, and we want to establish a rural transit system. So what are those goals and objectives, and what are the ways you need to build your system to accommodate that? Some of that might mean changing your functional class or your jurisdiction of your system, understanding what performance measures you want to reach, and what are the ways that you can get to those performance measures with the money that you have through capital improvement planning, or adding in resources, looking at all transportation modes. And then, as I mentioned before, sometimes this gets overlooked. You all spend a lot of money or a lot of time studying areas and understanding and knowing that certain areas have needs, and you want to make sure that you go back and loop those in and incorporate those. Everything that you learned through doing those previous studies can roll up into this, so you get a comprehensive picture of your entire system. What are those supporting policies that you need? And I cannot stress enough that right-of-way management and access management can be critical to making sure that you are well positioned for the future and the growth that you want to have, or just protecting the safety that you want to have. Is that, you know, if you have really sound access management policies that are updated regularly, you're going to improve the safety of your system by creating good, safe opportunities the way your system operates. So just a quick walkthrough for Otter Tail County and the way they approached the transportation plan and the amount of time it takes to do one of these. Like I mentioned, it takes a lot of commitment by you and your staff to be able to pull this off. So for Otter Tail County, just setting that foundation, going through all the information, the data that they already have, and then looking at what do they feel their critical needs are, communicating that out with the public all the way through. That's the first 4 to 6 months. The next couple of months talks about setting those goals and objectives, doing that traffic forecasting and analysis. Some of these things can overlap. So as you're trying to develop your goals and objectives, you can also have your traffic forecasting going on in the background and overlapping. Then you get to your system analysis, where you take all that information together and you analyze that as the way your system is today and the way you want it to be in the future. And then you craft out over the last couple of months of the planning period of how are you going to go about implementing this? What are your strategies and what's your timeframes to be able to do this? Putting out that draft transportation plan and giving people one final chance to take a look at it and say, oh, this doesn't really fit what we were thinking, or, oh, this makes sense, is kind of that final step and final hurdle. If you really have good public and stakeholder involvement all the way through the process, when you put that draft plan out there, it should be so simple and so easy. If you don't make that investment in working with your public and your stakeholders all the way through, you're going to end up going back down this path and maybe having to go back and reset some goals and objectives, which then has this trickle-down effect of changing many things in your plan, and it's going to take longer in the long run to do that. So I can't stress enough how important it is to engage as many of the public and as many folks as you can. In Otter Tail County, that meant they did open houses in various parts of the county, and then they set up focus group sessions. The project management team met separately, and then they had a steering committee made up of different community leaders and industry leaders and elected officials from township boards or from city councils that sat on that project steering committee. They did 2 full-blown county board sessions where they just worked through some of these. They shared information out through a study website, and at the end of it, they had an open public hearing. What was the result in Otter Tail County was a plan that really embraced everything we're going to talk about in the next modules of how do you go about doing a jurisdictional transfer? Here's what their goals and objectives are. Here's how we're going to work with our townships or our municipalities for making those transfers that make sense, and how we would maybe potentially send funding with that or restore a road and get it into really great condition before it was ever transitioned over to another entity. Choosing your levels of service, or if you're going to go with a tiered classification network, that really worked really well in Otter Tail County, and they still use that today. performance measures and understanding what your goals and objectives are and getting the public to understand that, and then choosing what projects you do based on some of those performance measures and that criteria that really drives your community. And finally, the opportunity for revenue enhancements. Is there an appetite for adopting some of these special transportation taxes or going out and doing some bonding when we're in a good bonding environment? Some of the benefits of planning is it really does give you this long-range vision on what you need for your system and what kind of resources are you going to need to be able to deliver that. Once you get all of these different data sets I've talked about that we are so very fortunate to have here in Minnesota, it's really simple then to go back and just update that data set and see a trend line of here's what our pavement condition has done over the last 10 years. Here is the traffic forecast, and here's how our traffic is either growing or declining. So it's really nice to be able to educate folks on what that foundation of data sets are and then get people very, very well versed in what that means. When you really focus on your data and establish criteria before you're choosing your projects, it does help take some of that politics out of why did you choose that road and not this road? And people understand why are we investing our money over here and not over there? And it makes that political time frame of putting your projects out for bid and people being upset about things not getting funded or not being built that they think should be built goes away. Never is going to go away completely. I think we all know that, but it really does minimize that. And overall, one of the reasons we started this whole system preservation initiative is we have so many new city and county engineers that are coming into the system. And a lot of the old timers like me are retiring and moving away and doing other things. And when you are the new person in that office with new elected officials, they tend to point fingers at you as the engineer and the expert as to why the system is not working and you should figure out a way to fix it. Not understanding necessarily the role we have partnering with our elected officials and that we're all in this together. So this really does, going through this system preservation, really does create that opportunity for partnering and everybody being part of the solution rather than making a city or a county engineer be their targeted reason why they think their system is not where they want it to be. As I mentioned before, many of your city council folks and county board members become your next state senators or even governors. So you really do want to educate elected officials and turn them into infrastructure champions. And it's one of the added benefits that affects the whole state if we're all doing something like this. So with that, our next steps coming up here are we'll have an office hour to talk about this module, talk about transportation planning. How did you define the gap? What strategies are you using in your community, your city, or your county to communicate with your elected officials or others? We'll talk about all of that next on Wednesday, July 31st, 1 week from today. Not a noon hour one for this one, from 11 a.m. to noon for this one. So if you're on the call today, we'll send out that Zoom link later today or tomorrow. Along with that Zoom link, like I mentioned, we will also send you a PDF of this PowerPoint, and we will send you your PDH certificate for today's session. Upcoming modules, just bookmark these or mark them on your calendars as a reminder. August 22nd, we'll dive into the capital improvement planning strategies and how are you setting that criteria for those CIPs that you're generating. Module 4 in September, we'll get more into operations and maintenance strategies. What are other things that you can do to make your system last longer? And then finally, October 31st, appropriate maybe for Halloween, is to masquerade on how should that network look? How do we want to right size the system and change up how our systems are functioning? So with that, we'll give you a couple minutes back of your day. I want to appreciate all of you being here today. Appreciate your support of the state aid group and being able to bring these modules to you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Scott Smith or Mark Vasecki or myself at any time. Again, all the webinars will be posted at the state aid training link. And the original system preservation guidance is all out there on the lrrb.org website. So I would just like to take the chance once again to thank you all for being here and giving up your lunch hour to hang out with us. And hopefully you picked up a thing or two that'll help your network. All right, hope to see most of you next week. Thanks.